Hi, this is Judy from the Huron County Community Library, and today we're going to do a craft I call Sweet Treat Jar. So mostly I'm going to show you how to do the stencil that I made the heart with. So I started out with actually a pickle jar. Today I'm going to use for my sample a mason jar, a canning jar. You can use any kind of a jar. If you don't have a jar this big, I also did a smaller stencil on the back that would fit on a smaller jar. So the supplies you're going to need today are a jar, and preferably one with a smooth side so the stencil will lay flat, wax paper, painter's tape, some craft paint and a brush, some Q-tips which I'll explain later, Mod Podge to finish it off with, some scissors, and some ribbon. Okay, to start with, we're going to make our stencil. So I'm going to cut, or I did cut a piece of wax paper the size of the stencil I wanted to make, which is 5 by 5 inches. And I pre-cut 5-inch strips of painter's tape, and I'm going to lay them on the wax paper, just overlapping them slightly. This is going to be the base of our stencil. You want to rub really good, make sure they stick to that wax paper. Now the next thing I did was I took this to our Ellison die machine at the library, and I cut a heart shape. Now you can draw a heart on here and cut with scissors, it makes no difference, but come to the library and see all the Ellison shapes we have, and we have butterflies, all kinds of shapes. I chose the heart, I just laid it on top of the die, rolled it through the machine, and it cut the heart shape for me. It also cut the smaller hearts on the back there. We have another stencil with smaller hearts. So next comes the hardest part, which is getting the wax paper off the back of your tape, because we're going to apply the tape to the jar, and the wax paper kept it from sticking to the die that we used. So I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to score through the wax paper, and that gives me a place to start, and then I'm going to stick my pin under the edge and start pulling up the wax paper. It's not going to come off in one big sheet, but it's going to come off in pieces like that. So you're just going to keep taking your pin, sticking it under the edge of the wax paper, and pulling off pieces of wax paper. So I've got one I've already done here. Now I didn't have every little piece of wax paper off, but you want to make sure that you get the edges clean, because that's what's going to stick to the jar and keep the paint from seeping under the stencil. So I picked the side of the jar I wanted to put my stencil on. I'm going to stick it right on there. Make sure the edges are really good and stuck on there. And I chose pink to go with the heart. And so I like to use a sponge brush for something like this. You could use any kind of a brush. And instead of sweeping it on like that, I'm going to kind of dab it on like this. And if you've ever used stencils before, that technique is called pouncing. So I'm just going to pounce my paint on there, and I kind of like the texture it gives it also. So I'm going to be careful around the edges of my stencil. And I'm just going to pounce my paint right on there. It dries pretty fast. I'm going to do the whole jar, but then I'm going to take a little break to let the paint dry. Not completely, but I want it to dry somewhat. So I would go all the way around the jar with my pouncing technique. And if you have a wide mouth jar, it's easy to stick your hand in there like that one and hold the jar that way. So I would go all the way around the jar and paint it. So we're going to take a little break here while our paint dries, and then we'll get right back. Okay, I let my paint dry about 10 minutes. It's not completely dry. I'm not going to hold it with my hand. I'm still going to keep my hand inside the jar. And I don't have a lid on my jar, so I also painted the rim. Now, if you want to put a lid on your jar, then you wouldn't need to paint the rim. So the next step is I'm taking my little pin that I used earlier, and I'm going to lift up the corner, the bottom edge of the heart. And I'm going to carefully pull up my tape. Okay, that's not too bad. Got a few little smears, and here's where the Q-tips come in. I've got them in here in a little cup of water, and I'm going to take my Q-tip, because my paint's still a little wet, and I'm going to just clean up my edges a little bit with the Q-tip. So if there are any edges you don't like, just take your Q-tip, carefully go around that edge. Makes a pretty straight line then. If you let your paint dry completely, it would be a little harder to get the paint off. You could still do it. So I would go around there, fix what I didn't like. Once the paint is completely dry, I put a coat of Mod Podge on mine with my sponge brush, just one coat. I only use one coat of paint, and that will make it a little more protected if you're going to be handling it and getting the candy in and out of the jar. And then you could put a ribbon on the top to trim it out, and you're all done. So now you know the technique of making your own stencil, and you could apply it to any container. See you soon.